So when I realized that I wasn't showing up the way that I really wanted to, I knew that or at least I felt intuitively that if I didn't change and I didn't start to do things differently and show up differently in my family, that I was going to create a situation that could promote substance use rather than promote recovery.
For parents who are dealing with teens and early teens, who here really legitimately thinks that your kid is not going to have a beer before they're 18 years old? Anyone? Is there anyone here that really doesn't think that's going to happen? Because that one beer, for me, set it off.
I think because of the attitude that we had towards Jake, we moved out of suffering. We moved out of being a victim. We moved out of being a rescuer. We moved out of being a persecutor, and we moved into really adopting our own healthy behaviors. We obviously had to set very significant boundaries. And in fact, through a lot of that time, from the time he was 18, he did not live with us. So what we want to do is create the conditions that will support recovery.
Welcome to the Why Intervention Podcast. I am your host, Christopher Doyle, today joined by Pam Lanhart. Pam is a mother of 4, grandmother of 8. She is author of the book, Praying Our Loved One Home, and founder of Thrive Recovery Resources. Pam has experienced the emotional roller coaster of loving a family member with substance use disorder. And unable to find trustworthy treatment centers and evidence-based resources, Pam turned her own pain into purpose and began Thrive Family Recovery Resources in 2016. Thrive recognizes that families are critical components to recovery, and the team over at Thrive provides support and proven strategies to empower you to make real change and to move your loved one and your family toward wellness. Thank you, Pam, so much for being here. I'm really excited to get to chat with you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to be here. And anytime that we get an opportunity to talk about families and how families can help their loved ones in the best way possible, I am all in. So be me.
Well, thank you so much for accepting the invitation. It's really great. So you started Thrive. Was it 2015 or 2016?
Yeah, the idea formed in 2016, and we facilitated our first support group in May of 2017. And so back then it was just an idea, and it sort of blossomed into a whole organization.
Wow. And what's that been like? Just from the organizational aspect and growing something that's now making the impact that it is?
Well, it's definitely humbling, and it's been very organic. I'll just go back and kind of just share a little bit of why we started Thrive and how that happened. My story is that I was born for this work. My parents both struggled with alcohol use disorder. Our home was very unsafe. I didn't have the words back then to know that was happening. I think when you grow up in a lot of the families that you and I probably work with are families that grew up in a culture of substance use in some way. And that was how I grew up. I had 2 parents that in their active use, there was a lot of fighting, a lot of yelling. They didn't really know how to communicate well. And I don't think that's unusual for someone my age, because I'm actually going to be a great grandma now.
Oh, congrats.
I'm older. And so I think in that era, people drank a lot and it was hidden, and there was a lot of shame and stigma, and nobody talked about it. And when you were in an environment that was unsafe, you just didn't know that. You didn't know what you didn't know, right?
Right.
So fast forward, I married this really stable guy, and I was looking for peace and stability. And just a little aside, I actually have 3 siblings in recovery now, and my mom is still alive and in recovery. And my dad lost his battle when he died from the effects of his alcohol use. He was very young, only 51. But I would say now we're really a family that embraces recovery, and We have conversations about it. My 61-year-old sister is going to celebrate 3 years on May 19th.
Wow.
So
Oh, that's
I
great.
just love, yeah, I love that it's never too late, right? It's never too late. And we
Right.
get many calls from wives, especially that have our partners, that where they have someone and they're older and they have been drinking chronically for most of their life. And that was my sister's story, and she's in recovery. So there's always hope. And that being said, we knew we were a family at risk. And I do have a nephew in recovery from mental health issues, another nephew in recovery from substance use issues. And we really tried to bring in protective factors like eating family dinners together, enjoying the outdoors. We're a very active family, mountain biking, sports, you name it, we were down for it.
When
And
you say that you were a family, you knew that you were a family at risk. How did you know that? What made you presume that?
well, because my parents had substance use, and I think by then I had known enough about it. And actually, my mom, now that I have been doing this work, I realized that when I was 17, we did an intervention on her. And she went through a treatment program up north, Minnesota. And we did the family program. And I think there's messaging in there that, there are risk factors. And of course,
Right.
now we talk about adverse childhood experiences and
Hmm.
generational trauma and generational patterns that definitely can predispose us
Right.
to substance use or passing on some of the trauma that ends up manifesting in substance use.
Yeah.
So we knew, I knew that. I knew I had this generational, but I had tried really hard to mitigate that.
Right.
And I like to say if our first two kids would have been our only kids, we'd be having a different conversation
Sure.
because they followed the plan. And then right, we got little Jake, and Jake was just larger than life from the minute he was born, and a risk taker. And I think he had felt like kind of the black sheep, the odd man out, because he wasn't an easy child. And yet we still invested and did the things that we thought would be helpful. But when he was 13, we got a call like, you have to come and get him. He brought a backpack full of pills to school.
Mm.
And we had known that his behaviors were starting to, that was surprising, but not really when you kind of think about, again, our family history and then risk taking behaviors, oppositional, and that was really the beginning of the journey of Thrive
Right.
because, well, I think that there's, and this, right? There's free support out there for families that have loved ones struggling. The kind of support that we needed with having a son that was 13 or 14 or 15 was really something that we weren't able to find.
Yeah.
And what ended up happening is he went to treatment at 15, and we had the benefit. It was a private treatment center, and we had the benefit of the family program that was very helpful, educational. It was geared specifically for adolescents, and they use now the CRAFT program, Community Reinforcement and Family Training, which is really kind of what our organization is founded on. Skills. We took DBT. It helped us become equipped with things like self-regulation, managing our distress, and communication skills. And the wheels were turning because I thought, this is what I really need in a support system. This is what I need and
Right.
what I needed at the time, but there wasn't an organization that existed that did some of that equipping.
So before we talk about what you then, like what worked, if you can go back to so you discover where you get the phone call that he has pills in his backpack, and then your maybe suspicions are then confirmed at that point that maybe Jake is struggling with a substance use disorder. Were you even at that point yet? Or was it just what's going on with these pills? And then what did you do in response? And then,
Yeah, so
obviously the struggles.
we noticed changes, and I think at that point we thought it was more like smoking. Now, this was before vapes. So we thought it was smoking. We had found him out of his bed at times. I remember looking in our backyard one night at 3 o'clock in the morning and I could see that he was out there. I don't think that we knew. And even then, I honestly think he brought, and it was leftover medications from our medicine cabinet. So if you're a parent, beware. I think people now are much more educated and get rid of unused medications. But I think he was bringing things in the hopes to sell them to buy marijuana, because at that point, that was really what he was using. From our understanding, was that it started really with marijuana.
Okay.
So I don't think that he was, and in fact, I know at that point he wasn't using pills. He was smoking marijuana, but then it escalated. So, and of course, in our work, we use person-centered language, so no judgment, but we don't use words like enabler because that can be very shameful for families to hear.
Sure.
So, but the term I use is make it stop behaviors. So I had these make it stop behaviors, and we all do that, right? Especially when we first discover that our loved one is using substances, or that can look differently for different people, but it might be, oh my gosh, the only one thing that he has good going on in his life is sports. So even if he's using, I'm not going to turn him in. I'm going to protect that because it's the one good thing. Or, I know his grades are bad and he's probably smoking marijuana, but I'm just going to minimize it or bury my head in the sand because everybody smokes marijuana these days. So we have our own mechanisms for, and that could also look like, and in my case, because I had grown up in this unsafe environment, when I felt unsafe because of his behaviors, it showed up as overreaction, over control, my own manipulative behaviors, the typical things that we try. With my husband, it was lecturing, the man talks,
Right.
it was, and I think like at that age, this feels really normal, but we thought, okay, we'll just try something different. Let's have him go to MMA, right? And the MMA gym are like big, tough guys, and he's a fighter. So it was stuff like that too, where you're like, and I know this even with the families that I work with that have older kids, where they might say, okay, if he just gets a job, then he's going to be fine. And the reality is, if he's very ill and he gets a job, he will use that money to buy drugs and it will not make anything better. So these make it stop behaviors are just these things that we do to try to mitigate harm, try to protect us from the trauma that has started to show up in our family.
Right. So at what point did it become confirmed to you and your husband that Jake was struggling with a substance use disorder at this point? So how long did it take you, given that you were deploying these mitigating factors, you were doing things with the possibility of knowing that addiction could be something that could be in your family? You have your other two children. It's not affecting them, but now here's Jake. At what point did it become confirmed for you?
I would say when he was 15.
Okay, so about a 2 or 3 year period before you really grappled with, okay, this is a real thing that Jake has.
Yeah, money started missing. He started getting in trouble in school. His grades started getting worse. And it escalated in January of 2013 when my daughter came up with a container with all of my good jewelry. And she said, Mom, if you don't want this, can I have it? And he had been collecting it over time to sell. And that's when I knew we had a real problem. And I'm not proud of this, but I'm going to say it because I can almost guarantee every family member can identify. Uh, and I looked at my husband and I looked at my son and I said, and again, I don't use this language now. We have an addict in our family. And if he doesn't get help, I'm not coming home. Because I had lived through that. And I was like, I'm not willing to deal with this again. And the next morning, Jake sent us a text and said, I need help, which is really rare for a 15-year-old. But all through his journey, and I think we had spent a lot of years connecting with him, building relationship with him. He was a very unique person that struggled because he never, I don't want to say never, but rarely did he treat us poorly. When he was in active use, he pulled away. And I think some of that was through this journey because that's where it started. That's not where it ended. But through this journey, we worked really hard to show up differently. At first, we were dysregulated, we were mean, we were confrontational. Someone said the other day, what does thrive meant to you? And she said, it gave me permission to not be angry. One. And we were totally angry, frustrated. And then, of course, when you have a 15-year-old and everyone in your world is thinking about what classes they're going to take in high school, we're like, are we going to be able to keep them alive? So those were some things that sort of helped us shape how we were going to be throughout this journey with him. And I didn't like the way I was.
Yeah.
I didn't like the trauma responses, the overreaction.
Yeah. When you say trauma responses, you mean your responses to Jake's usage kind of triggering some of the things that you had not yet dealt with from your past.
Yeah, because I didn't know. I didn't know. I think when you grow up in an environment where substance use is just what it is, you don't understand that sometimes your reactions are really rooted in that pain and those feelings of being, I think trauma is just this innate feeling of being unsafe. My trauma responses come from a place of this situation might cause me harm, so I'm going to protect myself in some way, right? And it comes from past experience, right? Of being harmed. So when I realized that I wasn't showing up the way that I really wanted to, I knew that or at least I felt intuitively that if I didn't change and I didn't start to do things differently and show up differently in my family, that I was going to create a situation that could promote substance use rather than promote recovery.
So when he said, I need help, what happens next?
Yeah, so we went into a premier adolescent treatment center. Thankfully, our insurance covered all that. And we had the benefit of a family program. And, back then it was still 12-step based, and there was a lot of language around detachment and tough love. And even back then, I thought it didn't feel right for me to call my son an addict when he was 15. I didn't want to manifest it. I think our words really matter. So I had tried some support groups, and where we ended up going was dialectical behavioral therapy as a family. And that really just connected so many dots for me. And then, of course, I started doing my own therapy. We all did our own individual therapy, began to kind of understand addiction, trauma, behaviors. In our work, we talk about the substances are never the problem. They're always the solution. There's a Irish proverb that says, they speak of my drinking, but never of my thirst. And what came from that is trying to understand more. Sometimes we just want to stop behaviors extrinsically, but we're not looking at why. Why are they using? Why are they behaving in the way that they're behaving. And so there were kind of two things that were happening and evolving. And this, he was in there's so much more to this story, and I don't want to delve too deep into it, but he got out of treatment. He had a return to use, got in legal trouble. And in our community, there was a juvenile treatment court program. So he was in a diversion program, flew through that. But then when he was 17, he was playing rugby on the rugby field and broke his femur. And so that escalated him into opiate use. At the end of everything, I think he was the kind of kid that like, I have to check every box. So he had used everything. There was nothing left for him to use. Meth, opiates, cocaine, alcohol was probably, if he were to tell you what his drug of choice was, he would say alcohol. That alcohol was the place, marijuana and alcohol then took him down the road to other substances. So there's a lot in that history, but I would say that again, through all that process, what resonated with us is that our son was a human being first, right?
Right.
And it's so easy when we want to protect ourselves to dehumanize another person. Brene Brown has a book called Braving the Wilderness, which I love. And it's really how we like file everybody into different categories. So, they're Republican and all Republicans worship Trump. And so I hate all Republicans, or they're a Democrat and, whatever the message is, they kill babies. So I hate all Democrats, and these are just or they're an addict and all addicts, homeless, worthless junkies, right? And so we get these narratives in our mind about people and we broad brush everybody until you start to understand the humanity of the individual. And things shifted when we started treating our son not as if he were bad or this was a moral failing, but understanding addiction and what happens in the brain, that he was ill, and treating him with human dignity as a person who really has a very serious struggle, right?
Right.
And as we started changing the way we showed up, I call it our way of being with Jake, our relationship shifted, right? Johann Hari, he says the opposite of addiction is connection, but this is what happens is that the society pushes people that are struggling with addiction into the fringes of society, right? We push them away so then they connect with their drug using friends, their unhoused friends. And we talk about boundaries all the time. So I'm not suggesting that we should not protect ourselves, but it makes sense, right? Like, I'm accepted by the drugs. I'm accepted by my drug using friends, hates me, and our behaviors probably felt to Jake like we hated him, right?
In what way? What makes you think that?
A lot of yelling, a lot of lecturing, a lot of, again, dehumanizing, just trying to get him out of denial, trying to create conflict to make him realize that he was harming us on him.
Right. Yeah. And so those are all of the things that don't work with someone who's struggling, right? But mentioning the Johann Hari and the opposite of addiction is connection, I think that there's the step in between, right, where the reason why the people with addictions get pushed to the fringe is because they're first intermingled with a whole bunch of people who are doing and saying the exact same thing. Everyone is drinking. Everyone around, it's not like eventually for the people who don't have addictions, they, quote unquote, grow out of it, or they get some other priorities that kind of pull them away from their old drinking or drug using behavior, that it was never a priority for them. It was never a solution in the same way for them, right? And so what I think kind of winds up happening, it's like you get pushed to the fringe because this tumult of everyone doing the same thing. Like if you think about a college fraternity, for instance, I think of a frat house. If you were to look in, step in the door on a Saturday night at the frat house, it's like everybody in here looks like they're an alcoholic. Everybody in here looks like they got a problem, right? But 5 years from now, when they're graduated and married and starting families and having jobs and various different careers, you're going to see that they were like, oh, that's what I used to do back in my frat house days. But they just moved on from it. And then there they are at the barbecue. They're 27 years old. They're having a beer. They're grilling steaks. They have another beer. They go to bed. But on the fringes are the ones who they had an alcohol use disorder the entire time. It was there from the very beginning, right? And so when I hear a story like yours, I think that what's empowering about it is that because you had some degree of awareness, because you had some mitigating factors in place, that's what allowed you to spot what was happening with Jake in a way that got him help in his teenage years versus him just basically coming out of the tumult 10 years later and having it be, painfully obvious to everyone,
And I need to share this part of the story, full disclosure. We did lose Jake. He died of an overdose in 2021. In the middle of that was relationship, was connection, was several years of sobriety, fun, was a family that had healed. One of the things I'm most proud of, because I think that the way parents walk through this influence the other siblings in the family. And I'm super proud of the fact that like our three kids all, just adored Jake. They gave him so much grace because of the attitude that we had towards Jake, or where that evolved to, we moved out of suffering. We moved out of being a victim. We moved out of being a rescuer. We moved out of being a persecutor, and we moved into really adopting our own healthy behaviors, showing up with love and compassion. We obviously had to set very significant boundaries. And in fact, through a lot of that time, from the time he was 18, he did not live with us. We had minor children in the home. It wasn't safe for him to be there. So, and I talk about boundaries all the time, in that boundaries allow us to put up some of those protections so that we can, Brene Brown says in her boundaries video, when you have proper boundaries, you can tread water forever. And the most loving, compassionate people she knows have boundaries, have good boundaries, solid boundaries, right? So we can't stay in this at all if we don't have boundaries. And boundaries for us were the mechanism for relationship. And this is the thing we see the most in our work is when you rest, or when you're tired, rest, don't quit, right? And so when families say, I'm done, I can't do anything more, I'm tapped out, to me, that first thing I go to is, where are some boundaries that we can set so that you can reclaim the things that you need in order to continue? Because, people that have loved ones that have special needs children don't get to quit. People that have loved ones that have parents with Alzheimer's don't get to quit. So I'm not saying that and I don't judge, I run across people all the time that they're like, I really haven't been able to talk to my kids. I get that. And at the same time, what I find is that, and keep in mind that a lot of loved ones step away from the family because they want to protect the family members. That the guilt and shame that they feel when their mom has lost her health, lost her job, lost her financial well-being, it makes them separate from the family. So like, my message to parents is, don't lose those things. Like, how do you stay well and keep showing up in life in all of these areas of your life? SAMHSA has these guidelines for what they call the 8 dimensions of wellness: spiritual, emotional, financial, it's environmental, it's intellectual, it's your job, physical, right? So when I am not practicing my spiritual disciplines, I feel tapped out.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm not taking care, when I stop exercising because I have used so much energy answering my kid's phone that I
Right.
can't get out at the end of a day for a walk or spend time with my friends, like you're going to feel tapped out. And so when families come to the table and they're tapped out, oftentimes it's because they really need to shore up those boundaries or step out of rescuing, right? So allowing for natural consequences is a core component in the craft approach in the work that we do. And so is reinforcing positive behaviors and the behaviors we want to see more of. This is self-harm.
Was there a particular struggle you had with setting boundaries initially? Like what was the most impactful boundary that you felt that you needed to set that you were really like, I don't want to do this?
Okay, so first of all, because he went to a treatment program when he was 15, we stopped giving him money or cash immediately. And even at that age, because there weren't cash apps, there wasn't Venmo, you couldn't order movie tickets online. We'd literally like go to the movie theater, buy the ticket, give him the ticket, and then let him go. Right. Because we were like, we don't know what that $15 is going to be used for. The financial boundary was the very first one. And what's interesting is even when he had times where he was back in use, he never asked us for money, never. And I think that's because when he was 15, we set a boundary. So what
Right.
happens is once you start to set boundaries and follow through on them, they learn. It's
Right.
conditioning. It's conditioning, right? And then the next boundary that was a necessary boundary was asking him to leave our home. And that was obviously the most difficult thing. He was so young. I think he was just turned 18. And actually, it was right before he turned 19. And he was an old senior. So he was a senior in high school. And it was Memorial Day. And we said, we cannot have you here because he was deep in addiction. And he was using opiates and benzodiazepines at that time. And he didn't remember anything that he was doing. And we had a 15-year-old in the home. So that boundary was near to impossible to set. And he did leave later, like the following year, he came home for a little bit. That didn't work out well. He left again. That time we were much more kind. And we just said, like, you have a choice. Like, you have a choice here. You can choose, and we will help you. You can choose treatment. You can choose we'll drive you to a friend's house, or you can call them and have them come pick them up. Or, we can drive you to the homeless shelter, Union Gospel Mission in St. Paul. And you get to decide, but we can't support you living here anymore with this active use. So at that point, we had become regulated. We were very level-headed. He's not bad, he's ill, but we just had to set that boundary.
Yeah. And so then
And,
what happened? What happened next? Yeah.
He left, and then 2 weeks later, he went to treatment. He
That's
chose
typically
treatment.
how that goes. And isn't that, I mean, when you work with families and you explain it to them in that fashion, how often do you see that that's typically the response?
Yeah, I think, I think that obviously, I'm a very white suburban person. A lot of kids I find that grow up in comfortable homes do not want to be homeless. So you have that going for you. And if you do not have that going for you, you might make different decisions or offer some other type of help. I think nowadays, in our systems of care in Minnesota, there are treatment programs that offer housing. So there are other housing options. What I tend to, when I work with families, I will, when they set those kind of boundaries, I'll say a couple things. One is give them a place to go or show them an option, they get to choose. And then the second thing is create a pathway for reunification, right? As you go, as you connect with your loved one, like, we want you to be well. We love you. We value our relationship with you. And that, what that looks like for us is, aging in treatment and aftercare and recovery supports. And we will always be here to support you. We just cannot support you with housing or with money at this point.
Yeah. So in all of the work that you do, and I do very similar work, I'm curious how you help family members overcome their resistance to making these changes. Or, said in another way, what does it take? What have you seen it take to get family members typically to a place where they recognize, oh, these are changes that I'm going to have to make internally to get over this discomfort of, having to do this, as you mentioned in your own story, right? Facing some of your own history and knowing that you had inner work to do, and then taking on that challenge to say, this is what I want to do for me. And then because you made those changes, those had positive effects on the rest of your family. How do we get people, how do you address that with people who are maybe brand new? You probably see that often, right? When they're just showing up and they are in it and they're not interested in
setting boundaries.
I have to overcome all this stuff within me. No, he just needs to stop and needs to do what I'm telling him.
So typically, okay, there's a couple that I want to make is that when we tell someone what to do, it activates their natural rebellion. So I try not to tell someone that they have to do anything. Usually I use open-ended questioning. It's called motivational interviewing to just kind of, tell me more about your situation, empathy, compassion. What are your options? What do you think you can do? What might you not feel comfortable doing? And then people only change at the rate of their pain, right? At the speed of their pain. And so when I work with families, if they, sometimes I will refer out to an interventionist if they're really desperate. I don't do that myself. And we really use the ARISE method of interventions, which is a very invitational process. They're really stuck. And we've had people, I had a woman call, I bet you we gave her 100 things that she could do, right? So I remind them, like, you are not powerless and there are many things that you can do. And so let's maybe start with something small, right? What can you change in your life? Can you set a boundary with money? Can you set a boundary with, we had a mom new in our community recently, and her son lives across the street and he keeps coming over and, destroying property and things like that. And we're like, are you willing to live that way? Maybe you need to file a no trespassing order or a restraining order. So, just finding their pain points and really digging into why they're not willing. Maybe they have their own trauma that will say, usually pretty early on. So this is something right now that is working for you, that, like, your need to feel valued or seen, important,
to be the rescuer,
is manifesting in this behavior, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting, that is an interesting component that I'd love to explore some more. I need to have, in order for me to be a martyr, things have to happen in order for me to, express martyrdom, or, to be the victim, or to be the rescuer, to be the caregiver, to be all of those roles there needs to be opportunities for me to engage in those in order for me to fulfill this identity that I may not even know that I'm identifying as.
Yeah. I mean, it meets a need. That's the
Right.
bottom line. Me being the rescuer meets a need for me. Doesn't mean a need for them at all. They're not going to, they'll find a different way, right? Me sitting in a victim mentality, you call it martyrdom, I call it victim mentality, that, oh, woe is me. Nobody knows what it's like. I can't do anything. There's nothing I can do. That meets a need for that person. And that
Mm.
could be born out of their own trauma. It could be born out of mental illness. It could be born out of, there's a really great book that I give all my families called The Anatomy of Peace. And he talks about like these boxes that we end up in to meet the needs. And so maybe it's that I didn't feel love as a child. I mean, it could be really deep and you need to do therapy to figure this out. Internal family systems is probably the best.
Mm.
But maybe there's I was I was not seen, I was not valued, I didn't have a involved parent. And so this is my way of sort of mitigating that or feeling valued or feeling some worth or unconditional love. And so I will just challenge them. Like, where is that coming from? What is the need that's being met? And have you looked at that? So many, like, here's an example of a family where, the dad was really struggling with setting boundaries. Well, it turns out that he had an addiction early on and he was on methadone and he thinks he caused his son's addiction. And so he wanted to make up for the guilt that he felt. And I think that's a really common struggle is as parents, especially, we mostly deal with parents. We feel like our loved ones' addiction is a result of our own failure as a parent. And so we work really hard to try to make ourselves feel better, rescuing, or
Right.
by not setting boundaries.
Yeah, that's a guilt trip that you can't escape
Mm-mm.
because it's psychologically what's happening there, right? It's like I am guilty for creating this thing. I'm
Mm-hmm.
responsible for their addiction, and so I have to somehow fix
Mm-hmm.
the problem that I created.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an endless loop that you're never
Mm-hmm.
ever going to, get out of. And then
Mm-hmm.
psychologically for your child in a subconscious way, if they're blaming you, right, and the language that they're
Mm-hmm.
using, right, and they are saying hurtful things, and saying it's because you did this or you didn't do enough of this and all of that, it feeds into that. But in some kind of subconscious way, the addicted child is kind of hoping, if you created the problem, mom, I hope, hopefully you figure out how to fix it.
Well, and
And
the interesting dichotomy of that is that when we fall into those roles, we actually prolong the addiction,
right,
right? So when we become a persecutor, we end up as the bad guy. Nobody wants to be around that. When we rescue, we're contributing to the addiction. So these behaviors that we adopt to help ourselves feel better, to try to make the addiction stop, actually can create the conditions that support addiction.
right,
So, what we want to do is create the conditions that will support recovery. And so, there's two ways to do that. One is for us to start working our own recovery program. And, we talk about no right or wrong way and multiple pathways. And we use the guide of the 8 dimensions of wellness. Some of our community attends other various support groups. We have our own support groups. But, like we need to do our own work, dealing with our mental health, dealing with emotional uh, mature, learning to be emotionally mature, adopting spiritual practices, making sure that our financial needs are not being sacrificed for our loved one. All of those things are what I would say are recovery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Practicing self acceptance, practicing self compassion, um, just making sure that we're not living in shame or putting shame on other people or judging or making people feel guilty. So that's our work. That's our work. And then the second part of it is making sure that we're stopping behaviors that contribute to the addiction. And here's the thing about that. My son did die. And so doing that doesn't guarantee a loved one's going to end up in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
What it guaranteed for us is two things. I could sleep at night knowing that I wasn't ruminating over all the things that I did during the day that didn't align with my values. So, we want to explore what our values are and make sure that we're in alignment and moving through things with intention. And then the second part of it was because we learned to treat our son with human dignity and unconditional positive regard, regardless of whether he was using or not. And there were times when we were with them when he was using, and he, like I said, he was never mean. He wasn't nasty because we were, and I just think it was relationship that we had built with him. We don't have any regrets. I mean, the only regret I have, quite frankly, is that we would have learned some of these things earlier, that possibly when he was 13 or 14, had we responded differently, it might have changed something. I mean, you always wonder that, right? And at the same time, we know that 10% of our population is going to struggle. It's actually more like 11%. 40 million people out of 335 million struggle with substance use issues. No matter what we do
And
sometimes.
alcohol being primary, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Half of that is alcohol. The other half are, all other substances, right?
Yeah.
And, so sometimes no matter what we do, someone's going to escalate their addiction. And that's where then I move towards, and I do support, harm reduction, right? Or with opiate use disorder. So, I mean, I need medication for certain things, right? Like I have glasses. I wasn't miraculously healed. There are people that end up with chronic conditions that need to be assisted through medications. And for the families that I have worked with that where the kids were on methadone or Suboxone initially, none of them are on it now because they were on it to become stable. And then when they were stable, they titrated down and moved off of it. So I know that's controversial for some people. There might be people listening that are, opposed to medications, and you hear a lot of narratives around those. It's just trading one drug for another or it just co-addicted. And my experience with many of the families that I've worked with has been very different than that.
Mm-hmm.
That it has been an assist that has helped until they could get far enough along in their recovery where they could then titrate off of it. So again, these are my views and opinions.
Yeah. I mean, oftentimes the consensus opinion is being formed by people who are uninformed. Mm. Right. Most of the people that are sharing those opinions haven't necessarily been in the experience.
Well, and I'll just say dead people don't recover.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So how do, it's important, right?
Yeah. So I'm sober 18 years now, and my mother helped get me sober when I was 17, and that was the initial start. But I relapsed also, and I was out for some, a good chunk of time, right? So I've had like kind of lengthy relapses, and I've had recurrences. And so about half a dozen total. The reason I mention that is because in my estimation, looking back at how my mother and my father handled my alcoholism and my addiction, and I, own those terms for me because I'm cool with that. my assessment, they couldn't have done any better. And they still could have lost me.
Mhm.
There were at least half a dozen instances, and likely more, because I'm the one that's giving you the, I'm biased on, my abilities to keep myself alive when I'm under the influence. But, at least half a dozen instances where they could have lost me, and that would have had nothing to do with them. But,
Mhm.
it had nothing to do with anything that they did or didn't do. And
Mhm.
additionally, my addiction has nothing to do with anything that they did or didn't do. It just so happens that statistically speaking, 11% of us get this thing
Mhm.
when we're doing everything else that everyone else is doing. That's
Mhm.
really the distinction that I like to make, especially for parents who are dealing with teens and early teens. It's like, who here, if you're talking to, a crowd of parents, right? Who here really legitimately thinks that your kid is not going to have a beer before they're 18 years old? Anyone? Is there anyone here that really doesn't think that's going to happen? Because that one beer, for me, set it off. And that's just it. As though it is a peanut allergy, as though it is, whether you want to say it's genetic or epigenetic or wherever it comes from. But my parents, the mitigating factors, their understanding of addiction and recovery and sobriety, that's what enabled them to respond the way that they did to my behavior. And that's why I got sober as young as I did. And, it's just a luck of the draw kind of thing
Yeah.
that I'm still
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think we live in a society that glamorizes substance use
Yeah.
and tells someone gets ill from it, and then they're shamed and blamed. And I spoke at a college campus Tuesday night, and, a lot of kids in the room that really aren't exposed to addiction or don't know much about it. But I talked about that, like how many of your friends, and you've been partying with them and you're drinking on campus, and then you've got that one guy that you look at and you're like, oh, they're a loser. They can't handle their liquor, right? Or somebody who, smokes marijuana, like everybody seems to be doing now, but that one person can't go more than 4 hours without a hit off their vape. And so we do. I think that's probably, if there's a couple of things, like I said, that where parents can really contribute to it. One is shaming a loved one, thinking that shaming is going to make them stop. It's not. And, just like you wouldn't shame somebody that had diabetes or whatever, like we have to be really careful about that. Shaming
Mhm.
someone isn't going to make them stop. And then I think the other thing is just making sure that we're not like, I got sober. Like I didn't have a substance use problem, but I stopped drinking to support my son.
Mm.
Because in a world where we can take it or leave it, many of us will take it every time. And so what kind of messages are we sending? And I know probably in some circles that would be very controversial because their recovery is theirs and it's up to them. But I'm like, you
Of
know,
course. Yeah. But it was
if
supportive.
right. If I'm
Yeah.
going to tell somebody that that's like, if I want them to stop doing that, then like my husband has very aggressive prostate cancer and we're working on, and I've always been really healthy, but like getting him to change his diet, right? And get rid of sugar because cancer feeds on sugar. And so it's like, I'm doing everything I want him to do in an effort to support his initiatives to be healthier. So, like, don't ask your loved one to do anything you're not willing to do yourself.
I'm reminded of a story of my father. It's so silly, but he'd get in the passenger seat and he'd go, I'm putting my seatbelt on now. He would just do that repeatedly with
Mhm.
guys that he worked
Mhm.
with who weren't wearing their seatbelt. You know,
Mm,
and then
I
they
love
would pick
that.
up on it eventually after the fourth or fifth time. Why does he keep saying that every time he gets in the car? I'm putting my seatbelt on now. He's announcing it. And so
Yeah. And
it's
I love that
behavioral.
because he's not telling them what to do. He's not saying,
Right.
put your seatbelt on. So he's not parenting them. He's
Hmm.
just saying, FYI, my seatbelt's going on. I
Right.
love that.
Right. Exactly. And then you can communicate those things and you're saying, I'm doing this for me. Right.
Hmm.
And so it can be instructive in that sort of way. So I have two more questions that I'm curious about. So when we look at substance use and we look at the way that families can handle it, right? We go back a couple of decades, tough love and detachment and let go, the idea of, put your oxygen mask on first, which is of course instructive. I'm not, diminishing any of these really in some instances, but and so that's one end of the spectrum as far as a family response. And now we're on another end where I think that positive reinforcement, as you've mentioned, and various different approaches are far superior to those previous approaches. But as far as the responding in that way, what are your thoughts about just the idea of where intervening specifically for the purpose of getting your loved one connected to a program of recovery, in the way of when you talked about the boundary that you were setting with Jake and saying, you can't live here anymore, but here are the options. Here's what we're willing to do to support your recovery, but we're no longer going to inadvertently support your addiction by allowing you to live here. So here's your option. You could do this, you could do this, you could do this. And then 2 weeks later, he wound up in treatment. Is that a part of, would you say, a positive reinforcement, or is that something that is outside of that spectrum where it is a tangible intervention approach?
I think it's the second. It's more of a tangible intervention. So here's what I would say is the way we guide families. That if you're not in some kind of relationship with your loved one, they're not going to care what you say anyway.
Yeah.
And people think that the more they say something, the more likely that person is going to be to change. And it's not the case at all. It's actually
No.
the opposite, right? So I think that there's the reinforcing behaviors you want to see more of is something that we can do even when they're using, I know it's hard. Like I remember days when I was like, I love my son, but I don't like him. A simple example would be they show up and they're not mean and volatile. And you say, this was a really great moment for me. Like I really enjoyed talking to you because you were calm. And so you're just verbally reinforcing. Those are ways that we can connect. We can connect just by, they can't live with you, but let's just go to lunch. Let's just take a minute. Or if you're too embarrassed to go to lunch, pick them up and go walk in a park, do something to try to connect. Oh my gosh, we just have this beautiful story of a family in our group where the mom just started connecting with her son, and he's in a tiny house village for people that were unhoused and using, and he's now has legal consequences. He has to go to treatment before the 16th, but she's texts him every day. Yesterday or 2 days ago, she went and had lunch with him, and he was not mean and he was not volatile because she's nice to him. She's compassionate, right? And so, obviously when somebody's coming at us, we want to react, and we have to step away from that and pause and get out of that so that we don't cause harm on our end, right? So I would say, like my example with him not living with us was a boundary and was a type of intervention. But in our process, we also look at what we call listening for change talk or motivational hooks, which is like, I am so sick of waking up hungover every weekend. And our response can be, that would be hard. Say more about that. And what would it look like for that to not be happening? What do you think you need to do to change? And so it's trying to communicate more collaboratively to get them to have agency in their decisions. I don't want to go to residential treatment. Well, they're not ready. Oh, okay. I heard you say you don't want to go to residential treatment, but you didn't say you wouldn't go to treatment. What would that look like? What would treatment look like for you? What would getting well look like for you? And so I think like just being curious, listening well, exploring, self-exploration with your loved one, those are things that are proving to be very much more effective when it comes to creating connection. Now, again, you can't do that without boundaries. But you can do it. And I know, my sister was on math, right? And so how I did that and what that looked like practically for me was I would send her a text and just say, "Hey, thinking of you today, love you, just checking in." She would send me a string of 12 texts about how, the neighbors were recording her and, she was hearing voices in the apartment next and everybody was out to get her. And I would just block her for a while. I wouldn't read them because if I read them, I would want to get defensive. And then I would block her for a while. And then I would unblock her and send another text saying, "Just want you to know I love you." And so then when she did want to go to treatment because she knew that I had resources and could help her, guess who she reached out to? Was my brother
Right.
and I, because we were safe people for her.
Yes. One thing I heard you share was something to the effect of, if this was the last text, would you be proud of that text, or would you be
Mhm.
okay with this being the last text?
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's all I have to look at now. That's what I have of my son are his text messages. And he had gone back out on a Thursday. Like I found out at 5 o'clock Thursday. And by 1 o'clock in the morning Saturday, so essentially Friday night, he was gone. I have the ability to go back and read those texts and, "Sorry, this is going on. What do you think you need to do?" Like his girlfriend, he was living in Colorado. I was in Minnesota. His girlfriend was with him. So I was kind of coaching her from behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And we were, the last text I sent to him was a clip from a song called Rescue by Lauren Daigle. I was at her concert that Friday night. I recorded it and I sent it to him and I said, "Truth right here. Love you, buddy." And that was the last text I sent.
Mm.
And the words were, "I will send out an army to find you in the middle of the darkest night. It's true. I will rescue you." And that's what I have. And
Mm.
it's a gift. It's such a gift because we don't know.
Yeah, that's the thing where I feel like communicating that to families is something that they likely take for granted because as a parent, you're just incapable of putting yourself into the position of considering even the possibility of losing your
Mhm.
child. I feel like it's, in a intellectual way, maybe, but to actually step into the potential feeling of grief and loss that you might feel is not something I think parents can really allow themselves to do, right?
Yeah.
So
And
communicating that.
yeah. And I think, so a couple things come to mind. And one is people say they love their kids, but what does that really look like? What does love look like as a verb, right? Is it yelling, fighting, confronting, or is it, acceptance and compassion and just understanding that they're an adult and they have to make their choices, right? And then the second thing I say often is you often say you would die for your kids, but the question is, will you live for them? Will you live for them? Because addiction may be taking your child, but don't give it the 2-for-1 special. Don't let it take your life too. And the more you live and the more you show up and the more you're regulated and the more compassionate you are, the more likely at some point your family's going to heal.
So when Thrive first began, it was out of frustration for the experience that you went through.
Mm-hmm.
And now, after losing Jake and experiencing that grief, and I've shared with you before this call that I lost a child also, and so in a very similar kind of path, having the frustration of the way that the system is, the approach is that. As soon as I learned about intervention, I was like, why doesn't everybody know about this? Why aren't we doing this everywhere? Why is this not our approach? This should be what we're doing. These are the
Mm-hmm.
tools and the skill sets that families need. And then after losing my son Connor, which was very different, it was during delivery, and he had a shoulder dystocia and the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck. And so it was sudden and unexpected. It wasn't something that we were planning for. And obviously, you don't even think, that's a possibility. but you never think that's something that would actually happen. You don't consider it ahead of time. You're just now thrust into where you've lost a son. So now having that feeling, I find that the grief has impacted the motivation in a different way. And so, communicating that, or I guess the question is, has that happened for you? And how is that something that, reflects in your work now with parents in a way that's not maybe too much for them to handle?
Yeah. So one of the things that, okay, so this is kind of a two-part answer. Way back when we were naming the organization, the thought came to me, which was, I don't want to just survive, I want to thrive. And so we've always had a focus on life and living. And of course, we have resources for people that have lost their loved ones, and we pass those on. But everything about our work remains the same, which is, and maybe I'm a little more passionate about this now, which is that we want to make sure that you live your life and that you don't live it with regrets, right? And so I think that probably the only thing that really has changed is just the message. Obviously, we were a family in recovery and now we're a family of loss. But I think the other thing is it's made me way more compassionate and empathetic. And, I try to remind families, because it just came up last night in our group, which is we're not all in the same boat, but we're in the same ocean. And in addiction, there is grief. There is a feeling of powerlessness in some ways. So I think and I do feel like I model recovery. And so people watch me, right? People watch how I've walked through this. And I think we live in a world of yes. And there was no other way I could really learn that but through this loss, which is, yes, this is freaking hard. Yes, this is super painful. Yes, I'm not okay in this moment. And I know that through my work, I can move to a place of being okay.
Well, thank you so much, Pam, for sharing the work that you do, sharing your story. How do people connect with you and make use of the resources that you have at Thrive?
Yeah, so we have our website is thrivefrr.org. And then we have a big, large Facebook group that has about 8,500 members. It's very active. It's all informed by this process of compassion, empathy, and it's Thrive Family Support informed by Craft, Invitation to Change. It's a long name. So, but you'll find us if you just type in Thrive Family Addiction Support. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to invite you because for all the families that are listening to this podcast, I want to just reveal as many resources as possible. I think that yours is great. I really admire everything that you've built and that you were able to accomplish. And oh, by the way, how's that program going when you received that grant funding and you were doing, I think it was a 12-week in-person training?
Yeah. So that's a prevention program called Strengthening Families. What I love about it is it's just aligned with all the practical tools and skills that we help with our family. So, what makes us different? What makes us different is the equipping, right? So even though, we can communicate, we can be present. Sometimes we're not always doing things that are helpful. And this program is for parents that have kids that are 7 to 17 that might be at risk. So we do have a lot of workshops and events that we offer. And our support groups are all support groups that use a curriculum called Invitation to Change. We have 9 virtual support groups every week. So you can check those out on our website and then subscribe to our newsletter, because when we offer something, we put that out on our newsletter. So that's a way to keep in touch with us.
No, that's wonderful. So that's thrivefrr.org. I encourage everybody to go sign up for the newsletter, get involved with a workshop. The more that you know, the better you're going to do, obviously. The more that you can learn about this, it's huge. Pam, I so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for doing this, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.